In this video, what we're going to do is take a look at the Redshift Jitter Node. So this is a great node for adding randomization to the color property of materials, as well as metalness, roughness. And as you'll see, there's lots of different ways we can use it. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so let's dive into the jitter node. We're going to start by using this gumball machine. This gumball machine is a model I downloaded from online, and the gumballs are actually different pieces of geometry. And so if I had modeled this or made this myself, I probably would have used, say, a cloner, maybe even simulated the gumballs filling this up, and that would have maybe made this a little bit easier of a process, though it is pretty much the same. I did want to point out with this example, it will work on individual pieces of geometry, and we'll talk about why here very soon. So let's open up our material, dock our material editor here, get rid of that guy. And we're going to want the jitter node. So find that, double click on it to add it. And the jitter node can add randomization to three different types of properties or values, color, float, and integer. And that means we need to make sure we connect the right property to the right part of our material. And that's going to be based on the type of values our material is going to be looking. So for color, for instance, is going to be looking for 0 to 255. Metalness is 0 to 1. Roughness, 0 to 1 as well. So those types of kind of things matter here when it comes to the jitter and what we can plug it into. But it's pretty easy to get started here. All we have to do is connect, say, the out color of our jitter to, say, the base color of our gumball material. And what we'll see is our gumball machine now has some randomization in the color. Now, where that actual color is coming from is now being controlled in our jitter node. There are three different modes you can create jitter from: name ID, object ID, as well as user data ID. Name ID is going to work if we have a bunch of objects like we do here, each with different names. You can start with a default color here. Black or white is probably, what I would start with. And then from there, you will find different jitter controls for each of the three properties: color, float, and integer. As we're going to primarily be talking about color with this example, as well as the others, this is where we'll be spending the majority of our time. Notice for our hue section here, we have variation for the minimum and maximum. So 0 to 1 is what we currently have, which is why we have these range of values. As I start to increase this, I can get more and more variation. So I can do that positive to 360. I can even do that negative to 360 as well, which will give me an even broader range of colors inside of there. We could also switch this to, once again, our default color to white. Notice how that does kind of brighten things up a little bit. We'll get to some of the other things here in a second, like saturation, where we have a minimum of 0. So that's why we have a lot of these white values there. If I start to increase this, notice now how every single gumball actually has color in it. And so if that's good, you can keep that. If you want somewhere in between, this can also allow you to get different colors, whether it's pastel, whether it's fully saturated, that type of thing. Both of these values so far, as well as the value we're going to be talking about here in a second, have a seed to where you can completely change it, randomize it, if you want to get a completely different randomization and pattern instead of color. So same thing with saturation. Okay, not going to be as noticeable as our hue, still can be helpful. And then we have our value, which you can see. Once again, kind of just helps with almost like the overall brightness of our colors. And 0 to 1 doesn't really do a whole lot. It really isn't until we start taking it negative that we're starting to get more of those darker values in there. And I'm just right-clicking on these arrows to reset them to their original values. So that is the jitter node in a nutshell, especially if you're working with the color section here. Let's say we switch this mode to object ID. Well, that's going to use the object IDs we set in our Redshift object tag. So that's what I'm going to add here. And even though I have a lot of these objects, this process can still be very quick. I probably wouldn't do this for something like this where I do have so many objects, but what we could do is add a Redshift object tag to all of them, go into the object ID section, check override, and you'll notice as I start to change this ID, the colors will eventually start changing. If I just wanted to quickly kind of randomize these IDs, I could just do num +1, and that'll tell Cinema 4D to look at the number of objects I have selected. And if we go up to the top here, this one's number 0, it's going to add 1 to it. This is number 1, it's going to add 1 to it, so its ID will be 2, and just really kind of just, get incrementally larger there. And that's another way you can work with this. Now, I probably, like I said, wouldn't use object IDs for this many. It might make sense if you already had object IDs set up. Okay, but as you can see, we have name ID, and that seems to work just as well. Now, you may be looking at our user data ID. We'll come back to that here very shortly, but that's the color jitter. Now, taking this a step further is if we wanted to work with the jitter node and a cloner. You'll notice each piece of geometry here, is actually just something I grabbed from the asset browser, but it's in a cloner, and right now the mode is set to instance. And if you were to take a jitter node and connect it, its out color, just like we did previously, you'll see it's going to work right away because the mode here is set to name ID. You'll notice though that isn't the case if I switch to say render instance or multi-instance. And that becomes a little bit more obvious if you solo this, where it becomes kind of pretty clear, at least in the other modes. Instance, like I said, everything is still randomized, but each kind of different type of object has its own color. And so that's, not terrible, but not the best way to add randomness or jitter to color, float, or our other properties here. And so there is a way around that. Make sure you're in the jitter node. We want to make sure we use user data ID. We also want to make sure we're in, an instance mode of render or multi-instance. And we're going to create an integer user data ID node, and then connect this to the general user data. Okay. So the last thing we need to do is in the user data node, the integer user data node, we need to give it a specific attribute name. And this is going to be a little bit cut off, but if you click on presets and then go to MoGraph, you'll see there's an object ID. You could also just type in all capitals, RSMG-ID. Okay. May need to refresh this. But when we do, we'll see now we have that randomized color just like before. Okay, and it works pretty much the exact same way that we saw previously, whether you're in instance mode. Now you can use it in render instance or multi-instance, and that can make our lives a lot easier when it comes time to render something like this if you have a lot of heavy geometry. I'm going to switch this back to instance and get all of these things looking the same, making sure I refresh so I get what I expect here. Great. So let's say we wanted to go beyond color here and say, use something like this, use our float values. Well, what we could do is connect this to say metalness. Now, by default, it's not going to make that much of a difference because our float properties, our values down here, really aren't set to do much. The minimum of 0, maximum of 0. So as I take that to say 1, notice now how some values are, the metalness values are higher, others are lower. And we can solo this, though we may want to get rid of the colors first to just kind of get a sense of what's happening. So I'm just going to right click on a lot of this stuff to zero it out. But for saturation, 0 to 0 is pretty much all we should need to set. And yeah, now we can see, those values here. You could also connect the float to say the base color to kind of see that a little bit more. This is one place where connecting different values to each other doesn't seem to break Cinema 4D. So yeah, now we have ways of creating a bunch of different variations of a metal all in one. You could also take this and add it to roughness as well to kind of do something there. Now, using single values like this for colors and floats and whatnot is helpful, but what's really nice is when you can also work this into textures and to add variation in that way. So what I could do is maybe grab a texture from the asset browser. All I did was search for imperfections, and it's one of the ones, I don't know, about a third of the way down. And I'm going to need a color mix node. There's lots of different nodes you could do this with, add, perhaps multiply. But what I'm going to do is take this jitter node, take its color, out color, mix it with our texture, and then connect it to our color. Actually, not color, I lied, roughness. Okay, and so once again, I'll solo this node so we can see it, though I'm going to need to increase the mix amount here. So we can see now how we have that color being added on top, all right, from whatever the jitter node was onto our texture. Okay, if we wanted to take this a step further, we could maybe even plug that into the mix amount. That could potentially help a little bit, maybe even a different jitter node. Okay, and this is where maybe something like the multiplier add would help to give us some more extremes, because right now we're definitely working in various shades of gray, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but perhaps doesn't give us as much variation as we might want. All right, you could also, though, use this in, say, a color correct node, right? So depending on where I want to put this, could very easily take this, plug it in there, and maybe I wouldn't even need the color mix for this, but then take our out float and plug it into the contrast and see if that's going to give us anything better or different. It doesn't really seem to be making that much of a difference, but that's another way we could use this, right? Wonder what would happen if we set this into gamma. There we go. So unplug contrast. Well, looks like we needed both there, but now we have something that is pushing the values a little bit more. Still leaves a little bit to be desired, right? And the brighter values there. Maybe I use a ramp or something like that to help. But overall, starting to get some nice variation in those range of values. So that's a few other ways you can use the jitter node here in different properties. All right, so another way you can work with the jitter node is to actually change the color of a texture. Now, there are definitely ways you could do this previously. This, I think, works a little bit better. Now, keep in mind with this image, right, the place where we primarily have color is the red. Everything else is I believe, grayscale, black and white. So that should not be shifted or given color. Which does make this work a little bit better. But if you were trying to do something that maybe had different variations to the color, something like a sports drink or chips or something like that, this might be an easy way to do that. So what we're going to do is create a jitter node, and we're going to connect the texture to the color jitter color, and then connect the out color of our jitter as we've been doing to the base color here. From here, all we have to do is add some hue variation. And as I do that, you'll start to see that we're getting a bunch of other values here. Now, this is hard to control since it is random. So if you really wanted specific kind of colors for flavors, this may be not the best approach. But if you're not as, concerned with using specific colors and just want some randomization, this can be a great way to do that. We may be having some other issues a little bit there. I wonder if we could bring those back, with adjusting some of our other properties here. I noticed it's not on some of the other ones in the back. So, definitely think there's ways to fix it. But yeah, very easy way to take a texture and shift the hue randomly, on a per object basis, like we've been doing, whether it was just the color or roughness or other properties in a material. So lots of really cool ways to use the jitter. Hopefully you found this helpful. And That will do it for this one. If there's anything else you would like to see, please leave me a comment down below. And if you found this video helpful, I'd appreciate it if you could like it as well as subscribe to my channel. Until next time, take care.